So the goal of clinical trials is to develop treatments and strategies to potentially lengthen lives. It says and, but it can be or improve the quality of lives of patients. We've done many trials, Regina and I, not with the goal of lengthening lives, but improving quality. Supportive care drugs, drugs to improve mood state. Some of the drugs we've done she mentioned the kyphoplasty, vertebroplasty. These drugs don't lengthen lives, but certainly have improved the quality of the lives of our patients for sure. And we want to improve the way we use currently available drugs and regimens and develop new medications. But I will chime in, we also want to perhaps use drugs that are not even available for myeloma. We're going to bring them into myeloma, and we're doing that today. I'll give you an example of that from a patient with a disease that had nothing to do with myeloma, which I think will be used widely to treat myeloma now from a trial we're doing. And we want to increase the understanding of the disease. We want to identify the rational, like that really happens in myeloma, as you know, rational selection of existing drugs, and again, try to find some new targets. And we're beginning to do that, actually, in the lab and the clinic. So the survival rates have certainly gotten a lot better. As I mentioned earlier, we have more new drugs in myeloma than any specific cancer, with 10 in the last 14 years. We certainly, in our clinic, use a lot of that last guy, Doxil, that's not often used, but we think it's a great drug and very well tolerated. And many of you in the room who are in our clinic know what I'm talking about. There are many new drugs we and others are studying in the clinical trials arena from phase 1 through 3. And we're doing a lot better to understand the biology of myeloma in such a matter as it's leading the clinic. But I'll give you an example of how the clinic went to the lab and then went back to the clinic in a trial that's really a home run now that we're doing. So should patients with smoldering myeloma be treated? That's one area of a lot of interest. What is the best treatment for newly diagnosed, that is previously untreated myeloma? What are the best drugs and combinations for patients who are progressing either in the relapse mode or the refractory mode? And can you match treatments with the subtypes or genomics? We're not too good at that today, but we have one possibility now out there with a drug called venetoclax that may be happening with. So we've done a lot of this work at the Institute and through our CRO group, moving from in vitro, that is test tube, into animal models, and then finally into early clinical trials in phase 1 to define dose, but also to get a hint if these drugs are active, either as single agents or when combined with already approved drugs to treat myeloma. So the objectives. Well, the phase 1, we're trying to optimize the dose and the schedule, find if there's any side effects, work on metabolism, look at drug levels, and they're single-arm trials, and usually these are started at a very tiny, ineffective dose, and you escalate up to either maximally tolerated, or in many cases today, it's a maximally applied dose. We don't even get to that high of a dose. And sometimes we have a biological effect we want to achieve. We get it, and it isn't necessarily at the maximum tolerated dose. In the past, these trials were done exploratory, but the recent approval, some of you know, of pomalidomide, daratumumab, and dexamethasone came from a phase 1 trial, and we're hoping to do that with a new combination we're studying right now to actually get a label from an exploratory phase 1 dose escalation trial. Phase 2, we know kind of the dose from the phase 1, so we're going to start looking at that. They are commonly single-arm, but we've done comparative 2-arm trials as well, but they're not usually what we say powered enough to show a significant difference between the arms. And then finally, the phase 3, we're trying to define the efficacy and the safety by comparing 2 arms, a gold standard arm and the new treatment arm, to see if there's superiority. And these usually involve hundreds of patients, sometimes up to 1,000 patients. For example, the recent trial of Xgeva, denosumab versus zoledronic azacitidine had 1,500 patients in it and showed no difference between the arms after all of that work. There are other types of clinical trials. There's trials that are being done longitudinally, looking at genetics, other markers, see what happens to these folks. We're involved in the Janssen MM registry. We've been involved in other registry trials as well. And basically, you're looking at a whole bunch of patients and what happens to them over time, trying to define the factors that lead one to give one treatment versus another, and in what order would be best to do that based on looking at all this gargantuan data from hundreds and hundreds of patients. And then we've certainly done expanded access programs. We've done that with about every drug, carfilzomib, daratumumab. These are in which the drug has not quite gotten there, but the company's willing to supply it to folks and then try to get some safety data. And obviously we hope it's going to work because we have a hint from the data that it is really working, but it's not yet approved. So consideration, talk to the doctor about your eligibility. And it says meet with the research nurse and other personnel. I would say meet with other patients. You really should try to avail yourself of the opportunity to talk to patients who are on the trial. What's happened to them? How did they feel? Did they respond? We do that all the time. It's very helpful. And you want to refuse certainly the informed consent, which can make all of you afraid to go on the trials these days because those damn lawyers get involved. In fact, when Regina and I started doing clinical trials, the agreements were written between nurses. There were no lawyers involved, much to the dislike of my lawyer brother, however. He's the only brother who is a lawyer. The other ones are doctors, though. What if you get a placebo? Well, we don't do a lot of these days, for sure, in our trials, but sometimes that can happen in order for one to see if a drug is better than the other. But many times you're allowed to go from the placebo to the active agent once you have failed if you're on the placebo arm. So once I start, will I be obligated to continue? Well, Regina and I can tell you a patient yesterday quit the trial 1 week into it. She was having side effects. So you're certainly not obligated, and you certainly should take the power and say, no, I don't want this. I don't feel good on it. I mean, it's about you. It's not about the trial. We certainly want people to go on the trials because that's how we make progress. But we also certainly should not be forcing people to stay on drugs they're not tolerating very well. So aren't clinical trials for people who run out of options? No friggin' way, I'll tell you that anymore. Today, I think a lot of the best drugs are in the trials. And that wasn't true when I started doing this 35 years ago at all. But today, actually, the great drugs are the ones, a lot of them in the new trials. We hope you don't have to go on them because usually it means you're progressing if you're going to go on them. But don't be fearful that you're going to get inactive agents like it used to be back in the 80s when I started working on myeloma. And you're always in charge of what happens. You can decline participation at any time again, and you certainly should be very, very communicative about any side effects, any trouble you're having with the trial. That's certainly really important to communicate to the personnel, whether it's the doctor, the nurse, other people in the clinic. So you're going to have normal standard care, but the beauty is you're probably going to get additional care, and a lot of it's going to probably be done at the expense of the drug company. And they're going to watch you like a hawk if you're on a clinical trial. And I think that's something people should recognize. We try to watch everybody like a hawk, but I would say that isn't always true in all clinics, and this allows you to get really close follow-up. So clinical trials are used at all stages of the disease. We certainly have done that as well in our own clinic. We've done smoldering myeloma trials. We've done really pretty end-stage myelomas. We've done frontline trials. We've really covered the waterfront. We've done supportive care trials. We've done device trials, pain trials, mood trials. I mean, I think there's a lot of different kinds of trials. So it's not all about just treating the myeloma. So you should ask your treating hematologist, oncologist about any available trials. You can certainly check with academic centers or non-academic centers close to your home. The NCI, all these trials have to be put now on www.cancer.gov. They're all registered, and you can go to the MMRF as well. So don't be fearful. You're going to find it if it's being done. So eligibility for clinical trial, and each trial has very specific requirements. And Regina and I are, oh, I forgot they had to have that or not that. We found that yesterday on a patient. So it's really important that your doctor is really specific to make sure you fit after you go through all the screening. We go, whoops, we forgot you really didn't fit because you didn't get such and such drug. There are challenges: renal failure, low blood counts. If you have another type of cancer, they're not going to let you on the trial. If you have non-secretory myeloma, I hope that's changing with the BCMA marker, but it hasn't yet. Unfortunately, if you have amyloid along with myeloma, they're not going to let you on a trial. And if you had bad heart failure, severe peripheral neuropathy, you're not going to get on a trial. So each trial has all of its specific requirements, and it's very important that your doctor make sure everything is in order before you have that screening bone marrow. You certainly don't want to go through that and then find out, nope, you're not eligible. You didn't get some treatment that you had to have to be eligible. So the finances. You may receive some of the medications at no cost, not necessarily all of them. If the company's supporting the trial, they should really be giving you free medication. That is the med from that company. We try to make sure that happens. And standard of care treatment will be billed to your insurance companies as usual. You may get money to have to drive through LA traffic or stay overnight to be near a clinic if you're having to be there, say, on 2 consecutive days, or you have long infusions. And you should ask your coordinator what you're going to be responsible for in terms of costs. I think this is very important. So you need to tell, obviously, your study personnel about any prescription meds, non-prescription meds, vitamins, supplements. All these can be really important. Even vitamin C, as some of you know, can have a role in whether drugs work or not. And you need to keep a diary of any side effects. And I'm excited that somebody who just saw me a few days ago, who's a myeloma patient, her daughter, a breast cancer survivor, has developed a new app that we hope to work with her on as a much better way to follow side effects, because in my view, the way side effects are looked at now, you come into the clinic once a month and you forgot that 2 weeks ago you felt like hell. This is a way to really have a time-sensitive way of looking at side effects. I think it'll be very useful for patients, healthcare professionals, and to let the companies know the real truth about potential side effects about drugs. Really important. And again, you need to keep your appointments. We have sometimes problems with that with patients. And if you have a diary, really importantly, you got to keep the diary really accurately on taking the drug, count your pills. We find this to be a nightmare with very smart people, so you got to be very religious. You're on a trial. We need to make sure you're getting the amount of drug that you're supposed to, because that's going to tell us whether that amount is safe as we move forward, say, into phase 2, where we're going to treat a lot of people. And if everybody really wasn't taking the amount they said, that can be a problem. And specifically, that can be a problem these days because many of the drugs are more convenient. That's right, they're oral, but that means that we have to rely on you telling us that you took the drug, and you may not have. That's one of the downsides of oral meds. And of course, ask the study team if you have any questions at all. So newer agents, we have oral proteasome inhibitors. We've been working with the oral one from the group over at Amgen, carfilzomib's oral, aprozomib, there's marizobib, there's new IMiDs that are coming from Celgene. There's a lot of kinase inhibitors. We're doing lab work with some of these. There's some new monoclonals. Some of these are the same targets like daratumumab, like CD38. And there's novel mechanisms of action. Venetoclax, I think, is a very exciting drug. Selinexor, we're starting some trials with that. Some of you know that's a nuclear export inhibitor. And we haven't done any work with filnezumab. I think it's kind of not necessarily going to go very far. And then, of course, there's a whole immune therapy arena, which I'll mention in a little bit more detail in a moment. So we have phase 3. These are large trials, 2 arms, as you know. So this antibody in the first line, it's with Pomdex, with or without this antibody. And it's a very large trial. And there's a Nivo trial. This is a checkpoint inhibitor trial. It's being done with Implicity, Pom, and dexamethasone. These drugs are in a little bit of trouble because some of you know the next drug, Pembro, there were some issues in a phase 3 trial. So people are pulling back a little bit on this checkpoint inhibitor area, which has been very, very promising in solid tumors, lymphomas. Myeloma looks a little touchy. Venetoclax, this is a BCL2 inhibitor. It's just a pill, and it's being used to treat leukemia, other B-cell tumors like myeloma, but it's now moving into myeloma in a very exciting way. There's a trial of Velcade Dex with or without venetoclax. And then we mentioned the last one, the bone drug from Amgen, the denosumab. This is a drug which in a head-to-head comparative trial was just as good as Zometa. You can ask me about cost. Certainly it's different than Zometa, which is generic, but it certainly is a useful drug in patients who have kidney problems where you kind of steer away from Zometa. And there are a lot of drugs in early development, and I'm not really going to go through all this laundry list, but there's a huge number. The ones in bold are also being studied by MMRC, and we're certainly looking at these in the lab and clinic at the Institute. And then there are a lot of different monoclonal antibodies being looked at as well. So, in terms of the immune system, where I started my career up at University of Washington in the laboratory of a tumor immunologist 44 years ago. We're actually doing it pretty good in the clinic now. So monoclonal antibodies, you've heard about the two in myeloma that are approved. We have, of course, the implicity molecule targeting SLAMF7 and also enlisting the NK cells in the green circle there. That's an immune cell boosting its activity. And then we have daratumumab, which is an antibody that targets another protein on the surface of myeloma, CD38. But serendipitously, in the last couple of years, we've learned that that antibody also takes away the brakes on the immune system. And when that happens, you get a boost on the immunity, and you get this super immune response along with the direct killing of the myeloma. So these drugs, that is both implicity and the DARA, have more than just a direct hit on the myeloma. They actually harness the immune system. And then, of course, everybody and their brother's talking about CAR T cells these days. And this is certainly a work in progress. We're going to hear a little bit about this later, so I'm not going to steal anybody's thunder. And then vaccines, which I was working on many, many years ago. These are certainly areas of interest, using peptide genes and then peptides themselves, putting them in patients, see if you can enlist an immune response. We certainly think the jury's out on whether these are active. They usually can enlist or elicit an immune response, but whether they're really adding to the patient's outcome in a positive way clinically, we just don't know at this point. And then we have these, again, cell-based vaccines. I mentioned CAR Ts, MILs, and then we have these affinity-enhanced T cells. We have these new bispecific T cell engagers. Amgen has one. There are some others. And then donor lymphocyte infusions have been used. That's an older attempt. And then a number of vaccines, which I kind of mentioned to you as well. So smouldering myeloma, an area of a lot of interest. A lot of companies are very interested in this. There are a number of studies that have been done and are being done. Many years ago, Regina and I did a study with Cellbased, believe it or not. And then there's been studies with Revlimid. There's ongoing trials with Pembro, and there's interest in carfilzomib. There's a whole laundry list here of different drugs that are being tried in the smoldering arena. And I guess one of the things I wanted to mention and give you kind of a story of how clinical trials get evolved, not necessarily just logically in the lab, is a story of a patient who actually had a disease that had nothing to do with multiple myeloma called polycythemia, and had gotten a drug for that had been approved at the time and was new. The drug was not very effective. This is a disorder in which you make too much blood, and he was making a lot of blood, and he was getting bloodlet. He was getting phlebotomized to take that blood off. He developed myeloma, was treated with Velcade with no effectiveness, and then shortly thereafter moved to Revlimid with no effectiveness. And some of you know the story of thalidomide. This is a very similar story. In the interim, he had not been on that drug to prevent the blood counts from going up, because you and I know, you just heard from Regina, that Velcade and Revlimid can make your counts go down. So his wife chimed in, why don't you put him back on that other drug, Dr. Berenson? So that's what we did, and by God, he had a beautiful remission. And then he was a very wealthy man, very wealthy, so he said, what can I do for you? And I'm bringing my phone out because you'll laugh when I read this to you. I said, well, you can give us the money so we can do the work in our lab, both in the test tube and the animal, go to the company that makes that other drug, and we can do a real trial. So that's what we did. We went to the company, and fortuitously, it's all about knowing people. The CEO of that company was a guy I worked with Zometa on in the early days in the 1990s. So I had the long-term relationship, and he said, let's go for it. And so we went for it, and we started the trial earlier this year, and it's been a very successful trial. And I have to read this. You'll like this. This gentleman, this is from July, and he's currently in India on a vacation. He wrote me, this drug trial may be getting very expensive. My girlfriend Barbara thinks I'm getting more youthful. Am I reverse aging? And now she thinks she needs a facelift. Can you recommend a good plastic surgeon? And some of you know there are a lot of them in our building. But then he wrote, can you get cash discounts? And I said, definitely not. And then he wrote, I personally don't think she needs the work, however. So there you go. But I really think that you have to understand that a lot of what happens in medicine is really a lot of serendipity. It's not necessarily all logic. You have to be open to new possibilities. And I think this is an example of that, just as some of you know the thalidomide story was as well. And I'll just summarize and tell you the driver of research has brought us to where we are. I'm very encouraging of patients being on trial. And we don't want anybody to be a guinea pig. We think that you have freedom of choice. If you don't want to be in the trial, that's fine. We very tightly supervise patients on trials, and we certainly want to hear about any side effects. I'm like the #1 guy to say, that drug, forget it. You know, a lot of you guys out there who are in pharma know I'm not necessarily the biggest friend of pharma because I'm the first one to bitch about it, like the peripheral neuropathy of Velcade 16 years ago. I mean, these drugs got to be kind to you or we shouldn't be using them. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for one question.
We have time for a question? Okay.
You answered a lot of them already in terms of who should go on a trial, how can they learn about trials. I think the two ones that may be worth repeating, I like this question a lot. Is there a website or resource, Clinical Trials for Dummies? So what's the best way to get info in clinical trials? And can patients donate tissue for clinical trials is another question.
Well, as you know, you can get a lot of information from the NCI and that site. I also highly recommend, some of you know in the room, my wife's written a book on myeloma with stories, with some of you even in the room, that has a lot of information in it that's written for Myeloma for Dummies. Half of it's inspiring stories and half of it is from healthcare professionals, Regina, myself, physical therapists, pharmacists. It's just a really plethora of information. I think it's very useful. It's called I Have What, and I think that's a good resource. But I think that the clinicaltrials.gov is probably a good site for that information for those of you who want to seek it on trials. But your doc should be able to give you a lot of that. And a lot of the community docs really don't have access to these new drugs. They're not doing the trials. So if you want to get the newest drugs, a lot of times you're going to have to go to a center that specializes in myeloma. But you don't necessarily have to do that. But if you really want to get some of the new drugs, that's where you're going to have to go.